A flight attendant pinned a black CEO to his seat and made him watch as they brutally assaulted his teenage son. But what the CEO did next grounded the airline forever. What happens next will leave you speechless. He pinned a father to his seat and mocked him with cruelty, sure no one would rise against him. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The overhead bins clicked shut one by one as the last of the passengers settled into their seats. The artificial calm of night flight wrapped the cabin like a soft illusion, leather seats gleaming under dim blue lighting, the engines humming a steady rhythm beneath the floor. But beneath the surface comfort, something felt wrong. From seat 3A in Horizon Air Flight 719's first-class cabin, Draven Holt knew better than to ignore a feeling like that. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting the carrier on his lap where his infant son, Cale, rested. The child stirred gently, small fingers brushing against his blazer. Draven responded with a soft touch and a hum, low and reassuring, hoping to lull him back into peace. Cale was the only part of this flight Draven didn't prepare for, unpredictable, fragile, and more important than anything at the upcoming summit. A few rows ahead, the curtain separating the galley fluttered. A man emerged, tall, sharp-shouldered, with a clipped posture that could slice through steel. His name tag read Byron. He moved differently from the others, not fluid and courteous, but deliberate, like a man checking off boxes on a list of threats. Their eyes met. For a brief second, time held its breath. Byron's gaze was cold and too long, calculating rather than curious. Draven had seen that expression before, in boardrooms, on elevators, in places where his success seemed like a provocation. It wasn't just skepticism, it was something older, something quieter, the kind of disdain that didn't need to shout to be dangerous. Draven didn't flinch. He gave a slight nod, neutral but firm. Byron broke the gaze without acknowledgement and turned down the aisle, his polished shoes striking the floor with practiced force. Draven inhaled slowly. It wasn't the first time he'd been looked at like that, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Cale whimpered. Draven pulled a bottle from the side pocket of the carrier and rocked his son gently. "It's just a flight, buddy," he whispered, eyes still on the aisle. 2 hours, then we're done." A younger flight attendant with sandy hair passed by, pausing with a smile. "Need anything for the baby, sir?" "Just warm water, if possible," Draven said, nodding toward the formula pack. "Right away." It was easy, simple, human, but the moment was interrupted by Byron's sudden return. He walked behind the younger attendant, carrying the tray himself. He didn't offer a smile, just placed the bottle of water on Draven's armrest, slower than necessary. "Here," Byron said flatly. "Room temperature." "Appreciate it," Draven replied, his voice calm but watchful. Byron lingered. His eyes flicked from Cale's face to Draven's suit. Then the corner of his mouth curled, just slightly, not a smile but a smirk carved from contempt. Then he walked away. Draven's fingers tightened slightly around the carrier strap. He looked at the water, then to Cale, who was now fully awake and fussing. In another situation, maybe he would have ignored it. But something about the man's presence set off a deeper instinct, one honed over years of subtle battles behind smiling faces. The plane taxied. Cabin lights dimmed further. Announcements buzzed overhead. Outside, the airport lights blurred into darkness. Once in the air, the mood should have softened, but the tension didn't fade. Byron passed by often, each time with that same heavy step, never looking directly at Draven yet always hovering within view. He stopped often to speak with other passengers, his tone shifting. Friendly here, polite there, but when near Draven, he said nothing at all. Draven wasn't being paranoid. He didn't have the luxury. He'd built Titancore from nothing, survived boardroom betrayals, navigated mergers with sharper teeth than this flight crew could imagine. But this was different. This wasn't about contracts or competitors. This was about perception. And perception, in tight spaces, could become policy. "Excuse me," Draven said gently as another attendant passed. "May I speak to the purser?" The man blinked. Sure, sir. Is there something wrong?" "Not yet," Draven said, offering a tight smile, "but I'd like to ensure it stays that way." Before the attendant could respond, Byron appeared again. "Is there an issue?" he asked, voice already laced with irritation. Draven looked at him, long and level. "Just trying to keep things professional." Byron leaned forward slightly. "Then maybe don't make assumptions, sir." The "sir" burned hotter than profanity. Draven gave a half-shake of the head, refusing to be baited. "I've made no assumptions. Just requesting what's fair?" Byron scoffed quietly and walked off without another word. The cabin had grown quiet. Draven noticed a businessman in the adjacent row glance over, then quickly look away. A few others exchanged hushed words, uncertain but alert. Not enough to act. Just enough to sense the imbalance. Cale began crying again, more loudly this time, his voice shrill in the confined space. Draven unbuckled the carrier's top and lifted him gently, cradling the baby's head into the crook of his neck. "There, now," he whispered, bouncing gently. The lights flickered momentarily, standard turbulence lighting, but even that seemed to punctuate the growing discomfort in the air. Byron stood near the galley again, arms crossed, watching like a man waiting for justification. And Draven knew. This wasn't just a difficult crew member, this was something else, something deeper. The way Byron moved, the way he watched, the way his hands stayed too close to the tray handle like it was a weapon instead of serviceware. Cale hiccuped mid-cry. Draven kissed his son's forehead, gently rocking. The CEO's mind, built for forecasting market collapses and turning threats into blueprints, now focused on something more primal. Survival. Not just for him, but for the child in his arms. Outside the window, the stars were scattered across a velvet black. Inside, a quiet war had already begun. The next move would not be his. The flight was supposed to be uneventful until hatred took control. Byron Kessler's footsteps slammed against the narrow aisle as he advanced with a tray clutched in one hand, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with something darker than mere annoyance. Passengers stirred subtly, the cabin humming with unspoken discomfort. A baby's cry, high-pitched and rhythmic, cut through the low drone of engines and stirred a rising unease that clung to the air like static before a storm. Draven Holt adjusted Cale in the soft carrier strapped to his chest, rocking gently to soothe him. The baby's cries had started moments ago. Sharp, urgent, but not unusual for a child disturbed by cabin pressure or the shifting temperature of a midnight flight. Draven whispered to him, his voice low, calming. "It's okay, little one. Just breathe with me." He reached toward the call button and pressed it. A simple request, water, to mix with the baby's formula. Byron appeared seconds later. His movements were brisk, almost mechanical, but his face held no warmth. The plastic cup hit the tray table with a soft thud. He didn't speak at first, just looked down at Draven, his lips curling into a small bitter smile. "You sure it's necessary?" Byron finally said, his voice low enough not to alert others but sharp enough to sting. "We've got 30 other passengers trying to sleep." Draven blinked. "It's just water." For his formula, Byron gave a slow, deliberate nod, but the smirk lingered. "Right, of course." Then he turned, muttering under his breath, the words too muffled to catch, yet their tone was unmistakable. Contempt disguised as policy. Draven frowned, his instincts pricking. Something about the man's demeanor was wrong, not just unkind, but calculated. Across the aisle, a younger flight attendant passed by, Simon Hale, slender and nervous-looking. He glanced toward Draven and, in a split second, mouthed something that froze Draven's breath. "Sorry." It was quick, apologetic, and laced with quiet fear. The message landed hard. He knows this isn't right. He's seen it before. Still, Draven tried to center himself. "Focus on Cale," he whispered, gently tilting the bottle toward his son's mouth. The baby quieted for a moment, suckling, but then the air pressure shifted, and Cale let out another wail, sharper now, urgent, confused. That was the moment Byron returned. He came faster this time, tray rattling in his grip as he stormed down the aisle like a judge entering a courtroom. "Sir," he barked loud enough for Rose nearby to hear, "you need to silence your child." Draven stared at him, stunned by the audacity. "He's an infant," he replied calmly, though his voice tightened at the edges. "He's crying. I'm feeding him. This is normal." Byron crouched beside him, bringing his face close. The lighting caught the sweat along his temple and the hard lines of a forced grin. "This isn't a nursery. Some of us believe in discipline." A few passengers turned their heads. The tension snapped taut like a stretched wire. Byron's eyes flicked toward them, then back to Draven. "I have every right to comfort my son," Draven said, firmer now. "You're out of line." That did it. Byron straightened abruptly, shoulders squared like a man ready to provoke. "Are you refusing a crew member's request?" "I'm refusing to let anyone tell me not to care for my own child." Gasps rippled through the cabin as the confrontation became public. A man 2 rows back raised his phone slightly, camera pointed low but steady. Another woman, older, peeked over her glasses with narrowed eyes, but no one said a word. Silence filled the space between justice and fear. Byron stepped back slowly, eyes never leaving Draven. His hand tapped the tray in a soft rhythm, a signal, or maybe just a nervous tick. Then he gave a cold nod, speaking as if delivering a verdict. "Fine, we'll handle this another way." And then he vanished down the aisle, disappearing behind the curtain near the galley. Draven's heart thudded against his ribs. He looked down at Cale, whose cries were fading into soft hiccups. He wanted to believe it was over, but his gut told him otherwise. The way Byron had moved, spoken, stared, it wasn't irritation. It was bait, a test, and Draven had just failed it by standing his ground. Simon Hale passed again, his eyes flicking nervously toward the front. He didn't stop, but the tremble in his hand spoke volumes. Something was brewing, and no one had the courage to stop it, at least not yet. Draven reached for his phone, opened the camera app, and pressed record, just in case. The fuse had been lit, though no one knew how far the fire would spread. The turbulence hit without warning, a sudden dip that sent trays rattling and passengers clutching their armrests. Draven Holt barely had time to adjust Cale's carrier before Byron Kessler was on him. The flight attendant's movements were swift and too intentional to be a reflex. His hand came down hard on Draven's shoulder, pinning him back against the seat with unnecessary force. "You don't control this cabin, I do," Byron hissed, his face just inches from Draven's. The words slithered out like poison, low enough to escape most ears but sharp enough to slice through Draven's patience. Draven's breath caught in his throat. He tried to rise, to shove Byron's hand away, but the grip tightened. The metal armrest dug into his shoulder blade, restricting movement and sending a jolt of pain down his spine. Cale whimpered softly, the baby's cries muffled but pained, as if sensing the rising danger. The dim overhead lights flickered slightly as the cabin shook again. Across the aisle, Simon Hale, the young flight attendant who had earlier shown sympathy, froze mid-step. His eyes locked on the scene, Byron's aggressive posture, Draven's restrained form, and Cale's tiny body twitching with discomfort. Simon's jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides, torn between protocol and conscience. His training told him to follow the lead attendant, but his gut screamed that something was terribly wrong. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some glanced away, pretending not to see. Others peered cautiously over headrests, unsure whether to intervene or wait for it to de-escalate. One man reached for his phone but thought better of it, tucking it back under his leg. In the quiet hush of a pressurized cabin, fear became its own restraint. Byron leaned in closer. His breath smelled faintly of coffee and something more acidic, disdain. His hand hovered near Cale's carrier now, fingers twitching as though itching to do more. "Control," he murmured again, not to Draven, but perhaps to himself. Draven's mind spun. This wasn't just about noise. This was about something deeper. Byron's hunger for domination, his need to assert power in a space where no one had challenged him before. Draven had seen that look before, not just hatred, but entitlement laced with a desire to punish. He shifted slightly, trying not to startle Cale, whose little fists clenched the blanket tighter. "Back off," Draven said, voice low but steady, like a warning that held back a flood. Byron didn't move. Instead, he raised his chin, scanning the row ahead, then behind, and finally flicked his eyes to the galley where another attendant stood. Malik Wren. Bigger, broader, and utterly unreadable. Byron's lips curled into a smirk. "Teach this man about order," he said under his breath, the words rehearsed, almost ceremonial. Malik blinked, hesitating just a fraction of a second before nodding and turning toward them. Draven's heartbeat quickened. He scanned the passengers again, looking for an ally, for a camera phone, for anyone brave enough to do more than watch. But most faces were lowered, eyes glued to tray tables or closed in feigned sleep. The illusion of safety was powerful. People clung to it even when that illusion cracked. Across the aisle, Simon took a small step forward, but Byron's glance cut like a blade. Simon froze again, shoulders taut, sweat breaking at his temples. Draven clenched his jaw. His objective shifted in that moment. He had boarded this flight with one goal, to reach his summit, to speak on innovation and progress. But now, all of that faded. The new objective was survival, not just for himself, but for Cale. He had to stay alert, had to endure. He couldn't afford to provoke further violence, not with Cale so vulnerable, but he also couldn't stay passive. Somewhere between those two poles lay the path forward. He eyed Malik again, who now stood at the end of the row, glancing at Byron as if waiting for confirmation. It was clear Byron had some grip on him. Whether through hierarchy, fear, or shared beliefs, Draven couldn't tell. But something about Malik's eyes suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable. That flicker, however small, gave Draven the sliver of doubt he needed. "People are watching," Draven said, locking eyes with Malik. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, you'll have to live with it." Malik didn't answer. His eyes dropped to Cale, then back to Byron. For a second, nothing moved. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade. Byron, clearly annoyed, turned and whispered something into Malik's ear. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, the turbulence calming, but the real storm was just beginning. Draven's breath slowed as he pressed back against the seat, wrapping an arm protectively around Cale's carrier. He wasn't strong enough to overpower two grown men, not with his son to shield. But he was observant, strategic. He filed every movement, every glance, every whispered command like evidence to be recalled later. Because this, whatever this was no longer just personal. It was systemic. Passengers had trusted uniforms to mean safety, but in this case, the uniform was a mask. Behind it stood a man who saw power as permission, cruelty as policy, and no one had yet dared to strip that mask away. Draven could feel it. The cabin was changing. Tension hung like a storm cloud above every row. Foreshadowing crackled in the air. Something worse was coming. He whispered gently to Cale, more to soothe himself than the child. "We're going to get through this. I promise you." But promises were fragile things in midair. The storm had broken, and now the cabin itself became a cage. The moment erupted without warning. Malik Wren, tall, broad-shouldered, and cold as a machine, stepped forward under Byron's orders. His expression was unreadable, his movements exact, like a man performing a task he'd practiced before. The cabin lights reflected off his polished name tag as he moved with mechanical precision, blocking the narrow aisle between rows. Passengers barely had time to process the shift in energy before Malik reached forward, his gloved hands zeroing in on Cale's tiny, fragile legs. Draven's instincts exploded to life. "Stop! Don't touch him!" he roared, his voice cutting through the hum of the engines like a blade. He tried to rise, lunging forward with every ounce of restrained energy, but Byron was faster. The senior attendant slammed his palm into Draven's chest, shoving him hard against the seatback. The metal frame jarred Draven's spine. His breath hitched, but he didn't care. His eyes were locked on Malik's hands, now cradling his baby's legs with a horrifying calm. Cale squirmed, his soft face scrunching into a cry. A sound began in his throat, uncertain and panicked. "No, that's my son! Don't you dare!" Draven shouted again, his voice cracking as panic rose to a fever pitch. He thrashed against Byron's hold, kicking out with his legs, elbowing upward, but Byron bore down like an anchor, arms locked. Malik's grip tightened. "Don't make this harder," Byron growled, his breath hot against Draven's ear. "You brought this on yourself?" The next second broke the night open. With a motion that seemed to echo in slow motion, Malik pressed Cale's legs down onto the solid metal armrest beside the seat. Cale shrieked, an innocent, helpless sound that stabbed through the hearts of every passenger. It was the sound of pure agony, unfiltered and unforgettable. And then, crack. A grotesque snap echoed across the cabin, louder than the engines. Cale's legs folded unnaturally. Blood sprayed across the white baby blanket, splattering onto Draven's shirt. The baby's scream went impossibly higher, his entire body twisting in pain, his arms flailing. Draven's mind blanked for half a second. No coherent thought survived in that silence, only the pounding of his heart, the searing of his throat, the blurring of his vision. He stopped struggling, not from surrender, but from shock. His muscles locked, not in fear, but in disbelief. His baby, his son. Across the aisle, Simon Hale stood frozen, his eyes wide, his lips parted but no sound escaping. One hand twitched at his side as though trying to move, to act, but couldn't decide what to do. A few passengers rose slightly from their seats, gasps mingling with stifled cries. Others had their hands over their mouths or clutched their phones, recording but too afraid to speak. Malik backed away slowly, the blood still warm on his gloves. His eyes didn't meet anyone's. Byron, however, leaned in closer. His face was calm, almost satisfied. "You'll remember who holds the power here," he whispered, his lips barely moving. His tone was chilling, controlled, deliberate, rehearsed. Draven didn't speak. He couldn't. His arms trembled as he reached for Cale, who writhed against the seatbelt, his tiny face twisted in unbearable pain, tears streaming. Draven cradled him, pulling him close, whispering soft apologies through shaking lips, his hands stained red. No one moved. Not yet. The air was thick with shock, and time had seemed to slow. Even the flight seemed to drift quieter in that moment. Byron straightened, slowly scanning the rows like a predator warning off challengers. He adjusted his uniform with precision, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Everyone knew it. The passengers weren't just silent, they were haunted. Phones had fallen, mouths still hung open. Even those who hadn't seen the act knew what had happened. The sound of that break, the baby's scream, it would live in their memories long after landing. Simon looked down at his trembling hands and then toward the front of the plane. His jaw clenched. A subtle movement, but one that hinted that something inside him had changed. Draven, his body hunched around Cale, stared at the floor, jaw tight, chest heaving. Rage burned behind his eyes, not the kind that lashed out but the kind that planned, that remembered, that waited. Outside the windows the world remained dark and indifferent. But inside, a scar had just been carved into every witness's soul. No one had expected this, not on a routine flight, not in a world that promised safety in the sky, but hatred had found a way aboard. And now it had left its mark. Passengers would talk, authorities would be called, the videos would surface, but none of that could reverse what had been done. In this moment, only one truth remained. The moment etched itself into history, a scar that could never be undone. Silence swallowed the cabin like a vacuum, immediate and absolute, the moment Cale's scream faded into a frail whimper. The sound of his broken cry still echoed in every corner of the aircraft, suspended in the stale recycled air. No one spoke. No one moved. Rows of passengers sat frozen in shock, some with hands clapped over their mouths, others trembling, tears silently slipping down their cheeks. What had just happened was not an accident. It was deliberate, calculated. A baby's legs had been shattered against cold metal, and not a single soul had been able to stop it. Byron stood tall in the aisle, his chest rising with each heavy breath. His sleeves were wrinkled, his hair slightly askew from the struggle, but his eyes still burned with that same venomous control. He slowly unpinned his hands from Draven's shoulders, though not with mercy, only because his point had been made. Draven didn't move. Couldn't. His entire body felt numb, as if the shock had fused his spine to the seat. His arms quivered as he cradled Cale, who now let out faint, pitiful whines that broke what was left of Draven's composure. The seat beneath them was stained with dark blotches of blood. Cale's blanket, once white and clean, had turned into a painful, living canvas of brutality. Draven looked down at his son's legs, already beginning to swell beneath the fabric. His heart pounded, but each beat felt like a scream trapped behind clenched teeth. Fury pulsed through his veins, so sharp and consuming it made his vision blur. Byron stepped back with theatrical calm and turned to face the passengers, arms half extended as though commanding attention in a courtroom. "Order," he declared loudly, his voice echoing down the cabin. "Order has been restored." Draven's jaw tightened, blood roaring in his ears. Order? This wasn't order. It was savagery. Yet the man responsible stood before them all, cloaked in uniform and pretending righteousness. Draven could barely contain the flood rising in his chest, but he knew now that outrage would not be enough. Not here, not yet. His objective had shifted. Survival was no longer his goal. Justice and vengeance had taken its place. A man in a suit across the aisle stirred, pushing himself up shakily from his seat. His face was pale, lips parted as though to speak, to protest. But the moment Malik turned his head, expression cold, muscles tense, the man hesitated. Then, without a word, he sat back down, shrinking into his chair. Fear still ruled the air. Dramatic irony twisted like a knife in every onlooker's heart. These were the very men meant to ensure safety, yet they had become the architects of terror. Authority had twisted into cruelty before their eyes, and no one had known how to stop it. Then a whisper broke through the stillness. "They're filming," Simon Hale murmured as he knelt beside Draven's seat. His hands trembled visibly, his voice a thread barely louder than breath. "Some of the passengers, they've been recording. There's proof." Draven's eyes shifted slowly to meet Simon's. There was fear in the young man's gaze. Yes, but also something more. Guilt, resolve, a hint of shame so strong it almost folded his spine. And in Simon's confession, Draven saw something else. Hope. Not enough to fix Cale's pain. Not enough to rewind time, but enough to ignite a reckoning. He glanced down the rows. Indeed, several passengers had their phones lowered, screens still glowing dimly beneath coats or trays. A few glanced up, locking eyes with Draven before quickly turning away, ashamed of their silence. But they had seen. They had recorded. The truth had not been entirely silenced. Byron, sensing a shift in mood, slowly pivoted his gaze toward the crowd again. He didn't speak this time. Perhaps he sensed the cracks forming beneath his feet, even if he didn't yet understand how deep they would run. Draven winced as Cale stirred again in his arms, the child's tiny body spasming with pain. The helplessness was a torment unlike anything he had ever known. He was a CEO, a leader, a man who built empires from strategy and vision. And yet here, seatbelt still strapped, clothes soaked in his child's blood, he felt like nothing. Nothing but a father crushed beneath the weight of impotence. But that was the last time he would feel powerless. He inhaled slowly, deeply, then exhaled through gritted teeth. His fingers adjusted around Cale's body, gently, protectively. This wasn't the end. This was the turning point. They had thought they'd broken him. They hadn't even seen him begin to rise. Simon leaned closer again. "They'll try to cover it up," he whispered. "You know they will. But if enough people speak, if enough of us back you—" Draven nodded once, sharp and deliberate. "Then we build the case here," he said, voice low but steady. "We make this cabin the evidence room. And when we land—" "You bury them," Simon finished, nodding. Byron shifted again, his voice sharp now. "Eyes front, no talking. Everyone remains seated until further instruction." But no one responded. The cabin had changed. The silence now was not fear, but tension, anticipation, an awakening. Draven stared out beyond the dim blue cabin lights, past the veil of panic, and into the storm of possibilities ahead. He didn't know what form justice would take yet, but he knew the fight had begun, and it would be scorched into memory, into headlines, into courtrooms. The cabin had become a courtroom, and every witness held the gavel of truth. Byron's boots clapped against the aisle floor, the rhythm harsh and deliberate. "Malik, stay posted," he snapped, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the cabin. Malik Wren, the towering attendant with a guarded expression, stiffened near the emergency exit, arms crossed over his chest like a silent sentinel. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence alone was meant to intimidate. Draven Holt, still strapped in his seat, cradled his injured son against his chest. Cale whimpered softly, breath catching on every sob as his small body trembled beneath the blood-streaked blanket. Draven whispered gently into his son's ear, the words not for comfort, but for conviction. "I've got you, Cale. I swear, they will answer for this." His voice cracked, not from fear but from the weight of helplessness pressing into his chest like a vice. The cabin's silence was unnatural, fragile like thin glass, one scream away from shattering. Some passengers sat rigid, their knuckles white against the armrests. Others dared to shift, pulling phones discreetly from jacket sleeves and handbags, cameras angled low, eyes flickering between Byron and the broken man in seat 14A. The scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air, but now it was overshadowed by something thicker, dread. Byron marched back and forth like a general inspecting a defeated army. "Everyone stay seated. Any more outbursts and we divert. You want to be arrested at 30,000 feet?" His words were threats, not warnings, but his smirk gave him away. He enjoyed this, the fear, the control, the silence. From near the back of the plane, a quiet voice spoke. "I already texted my brother. He's with the TSA. He'll be waiting when we land." Eris Danner leaned forward in his seat, whispering through clenched teeth to a man across the aisle. The tension in his voice betrayed the calmness he tried to portray. His phone, tucked beneath the tray table, blinked with a single sent message. Byron's head jerked around like a hound catching scent. What was that? He strode to the rear, scanning faces. Eris sank back, feigning sleep, phone gone. Byron's eyes lingered on him for a moment before he turned to address the entire cabin. Any devices caught recording will be confiscated. You're all witnesses to an unruly passenger endangering flight safety. Do not make it worse for yourselves. The irony burned. Byron had turned the cabin into a theater of cruelty, and now he expected silence to be compliance. But he didn't see what Draven saw: the shifting weight in the passenger's eyes, the beginnings of resolve, the tremble of courage blooming beneath fear. Draven's eyes tracked movement near the galley. Simon Hale, the young flight attendant, slipped behind the curtain, pale as moonlight. His hands shook as he reached up toward the intercom panel. He hesitated, fingers hovering, breath uneven. Then he disappeared into the crew compartment. Draven's pulse quickened. It wasn't much, but it was movement. Someone, somewhere, was still trying. "Malik!" Byron barked again, snapping Draven's focus forward. "Eyes on him." He gestured toward Draven with a jab of his chin. Malik didn't speak. He stood motionless, but something about his posture had changed. Not relaxed, but uncertain. His gaze lingered longer on the baby than the man. For a brief moment, something human flickered in his eyes. Draven caught it and leaned slightly forward, still clutching Kale close. "You don't have to follow him," he whispered, voice low enough that only Malik could hear. "You know this isn't right." Malik's brow twitched, just enough to show he heard, but he said nothing. Byron's voice rose again, sharp and commanding. "I run this flight. My word is law up here. If any of you think otherwise, I suggest you test me." He looked around as if daring someone to speak. No one did, but phones kept rolling. Fingers kept typing. Draven knew that even without voices, the truth was already being recorded, already traveling far beyond the cabin walls. Kale whimpered again, shifting in his father's arms. Draven brushed a trembling hand over his forehead, then looked up. His eyes swept the cabin. Faces met his gaze, some ashamed, some enraged, most unsure. He knew that helplessness. He'd lived it in boardrooms, in press conferences, behind smiling masks. But this was different. This was not business. This was survival. And survival demanded strategy. He made eye contact with Eris Danner. The man nodded, subtle but certain. Another passenger, an older man in a green jacket, gave a slight tilt of the head. Witnesses, not just spectators, potential allies. Draven's mind raced through possibilities. He was restrained, his phone unreachable, his voice just one in a crowd. But if they moved together, if one domino fell, the others would follow. Movement from the front. Simon emerged again, his face pale but his jaw set. He didn't speak, only met Draven's gaze and gave the faintest nod before vanishing behind the curtain again. Draven exhaled through his nose. It was a whisper of hope, just enough to keep him upright. Kyle shifted again in his arms, his small fingers curling around Draven's thumb. Byron hadn't noticed Simon. He hadn't noticed Malik's hesitation. He didn't see the way eyes were turning toward one another now instead of toward him. He didn't realize that silence wasn't submission. It was momentum, gathering in stillness. Draven leaned down and kissed Kale's forehead. "Almost there, son," he whispered. "They think they've won, but they don't hear what I hear." Kale whimpered in reply as if understanding. Then Byron turned back toward the front, spreading his arms wide. "On this flight," he announced, "my word is law." But Draven stared ahead, no longer afraid, no longer broken. Because he knew something Byron didn't. What began as terror was turning into the first spark of resistance. Malik moved stiffly down the aisle, his large frame casting long shadows under the dim overhead lights. In his hands, he clutched the blood-soaked blanket, Kale's blanket, as if it were a ceremonial flag in some twisted ritual. The deep red stains glared against the soft fabric, impossible to ignore. He didn't look left or right. His expression was void of emotion, jaw clenched, eyes forward, like a soldier carrying out orders he didn't dare question. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin. Some passengers turned their faces away, too shaken to meet the sight. Others stared, horrified, unmoving. Draven's breath caught in his throat. He sat paralyzed, the straps biting into his shoulders, arms aching from resistance. Cale whimpered weakly against his chest, the baby's cries now more like fragile echoes than wails. Byron stood just behind Malik, arms folded, watching the display with twisted satisfaction. The performance was calculated, an act of psychological warfare. Byron didn't just want silence, he wanted obedience, fear, surrender. Then came a sound that cracked the thick tension. A voice, rough, loud, unpolished. "Stop that! Stop it right now!" Eris Danner stood halfway up from his seat near the back, hands gripping the top of the seat in front of him. His voice trembled, not from fear, but fury. His face was red, eyes locked on Malik's path down the aisle. "What you're doing is wrong, and we all know it." The silence shattered. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some gasped. Others looked from Eris to Byron, uncertain whether they should speak or remain still. Byron turned slowly, locking eyes with Eris. His smile was thin, humorless. "Sit down, sir," he said, his voice low but cutting. "You're interfering with crew authority." "You lost that authority the second you hurt that child," Eris shot back, not backing down. "We all saw it. You think people won't talk?" Byron took a step forward, but Simon Hale appeared suddenly from the galley. His face was pale, hair damp with sweat, and he glanced nervously between Byron and Draven before kneeling beside the restrained CEO. "They know," Simon whispered, barely audible. "The cockpit. They're watching the cabin feed. They've seen everything." Draven turned his head slightly, blood pumping in his ears. "Then why haven't they done anything?" Simon hesitated. His voice faltered as he answered. "They're hesitating. They're not sure what will make it worse." The words hit harder than Byron's hand ever could. Authority was watching, but choosing paralysis over justice. Fear of backlash, of scandal, of headlines and lawsuits, those fears outweighed a bleeding child and a father being restrained like a criminal. Draven's jaw clenched. He glanced down at Cale, who had drifted into a fragile, pained sleep. The baby's face twitched from time to time, a quiet reflection of agony. Rage simmered beneath Draven's calm exterior, not blind rage, but cold, strategic, the kind that studied faces, measured risks, and chose timing with care. Byron, still focused on Eris, raised his voice. "Anyone else want to challenge the rules on this flight? Speak now." He scanned the cabin slowly. Most passengers lowered their eyes, but not all. Draven's gaze swept the aisle, noting movement. A man in row 12 subtly nodded. Another across from Eris adjusted his phone, camera lens now peeking above his tray table. A third held his jacket awkwardly, clearly hiding something beneath it. Phones, evidence, courage, maybe. Not enough for an uprising, but enough for a spark. Draven looked back at Simon, his voice low. "You're not with him, are you?" Simon shook his head fiercely. "I'm not like him. I didn't know what to do. But I think the captain might act, if we give him a reason." "Then let's give him one," Draven murmured, eyes steady. Simon looked shaken but determined. He stepped back, preparing to act. Draven turned his eyes back to Eris and nodded once. They didn't need a plan with words. The nod said everything. Byron turned again, pacing slowly down the aisle now, like a wolf circling prey. His voice rang out again. "Let me remind you, on this flight my word is law," Draven whispered under his breath, almost like a prayer. Not for long. He could feel it building, the tension, the fear, the anger all pressing against the cabin's walls. If he moved too soon, they'd be crushed. Too late, and the opportunity would pass. But the moment was coming. The passengers were waking. The silence was cracking. And in that brief space between obedience and revolt, Draven saw something he hadn't seen since boarding. Possibility. As Malik passed again, heading back toward Byron, his hands clenched tightly around the blanket. He hesitated for just a second. Just enough for Draven to see the flicker of shame in his eyes. The facade was weakening. Draven leaned back, cradling Cale as gently as he could, and focused not on pain, not on rage, but on the next move. This wasn't survival anymore. This was strategy. And Byron had no idea how close the edge was. Hatred believed it ruled the cabin, but courage had begun to breathe. He thought breaking a child's dignity would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Byron's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "This man attacked crew. I had no choice but to step in. I prevented greater chaos." The words didn't just echo. They cracked the air open, causing heads to turn and uncertainty to cloud the passengers' eyes. A few flinched back into their seats, hands frozen mid-motion, unsure whether to believe the man in uniform or their own growing dread. Byron stood tall, chin lifted with the practiced authority of someone used to getting away with lies. His tone was steady, but his eyes betrayed something else: desperation. Draven, still restrained, met his accuser's gaze with piercing calm. His body throbbed with pain and exhaustion, but his voice rose, low and firm, weaving through the silence with undeniable clarity. "You want order?" he said, his arms tightening around Cale's fragile, injured body. "Order is truth, and every soul here has seen what you've done." A breath caught somewhere near the middle of the cabin. Whispered fragments of agreement spread quickly, hushed but potent, like sparks jumping from ember to ember. Heads turned toward Byron, but this time with wariness. Doubt had crept in. The very silence he had used to intimidate was now turning on him. Malik Wren, still towering near the aisle, looked away, his hands twitching by his sides. Sweat glistened along his temples, and for the first time, his posture wavered. His grip on his own composure loosened. He didn't look at Draven. He couldn't. The infant's blood still stained his sleeves, a vivid reminder of what he had done under orders. His jaw clenched, then unclenched. No words came, but guilt had begun to whisper louder than obedience. Near the front, Simon Hale stood half-shielded behind the drink cart, eyes darting between Byron and the trembling passengers. He caught Draven's glance and responded with a tiny nod, almost imperceptible. Then he turned to Eris Danner in the rear, another nod, firmer this time. The signal was clear. "Be ready." Byron was pacing again, lips tight, hands clasped behind his back like a commander clinging to control. "Everyone stay calm," he barked, his voice edged with brittle arrogance. "This situation is under control. Do not interfere, or you may be detained upon landing." But no one moved. The illusion of his control was starting to shatter, and then, as if the tension itself triggered the sky's protest, turbulence struck. The plane jolted violently, sending plastic cups clattering and seatbelt lights flashing above in angry red. Gasps erupted from rows front and back. A child wailed. Trays shifted. One nearly toppled onto the floor. Draven seized the moment like lightning snapping across a dark sky. "Now!" he bellowed, the word erupting from his chest like a war cry. Eris shot up from his seat, driving his weight toward Malik's arm before the larger man could react. Malik stumbled, thrown off balance by the force and by his own uncertainty. At the same time, another passenger, a wiry man with shaking hands, grabbed the blood-soaked blanket from the floor and held it high like a banner of truth, his voice cracking as he shouted, "This is what they did!" The scream of confrontation rose, not from chaos but from righteous anger. Byron turned, eyes wide, and lunged toward Eris, his composure gone, replaced with rage. But his reach came too late. Simon slammed the intercom button in the galley and lifted the mic with trembling hands. His voice broke at first, but then steadied as he spoke into the crackling speaker system. "This is Simon Hale. Crew abuse underway. We need intervention. I repeat, crew abuse underway." His words didn't just fill the plane, they shook it. Passengers gasped, frozen in place, the truth now undeniable. Byron stopped mid-lunge, chest heaving, hands flexing at his sides like claws that had just lost their grip on the throne. Eyes locked on him from every direction, witnesses, all of them. And then silence. Not peace, not calm, but the silence of something breaking, something larger than just a man's authority, the silence of illusion giving way to truth. The lie of control had fractured, and truth was finally screaming louder. Trays clattered to the floor as he bulldozed down the aisle like a man unhinged, his face twisted in fury. His arms shoved aside anyone in his path as he charged at Eris Danner, who had barely enough time to brace. Passengers screamed. A woman ducked beneath her seat. Others, spurred by adrenaline and fear, moved to intercept. One man grabbed Byron's arm. Another swung his belt like a lasso, catching the flight attendant across the back. Pens jabbed, fists flew, and still Byron fought forward, roaring like an animal cornered. Amid the chaos, Draven felt the grip on his shoulder loosen just long enough. He didn't hesitate. With a surge of strength born from pain and fury, Draven broke free, pulling Cale close against his chest. The baby whimpered, his tiny body trembling. Blood had soaked through the edge of the blanket, and Draven's heart cracked at the sound. But there was no time for grief. Not yet. He turned just as Byron threw off another passenger and grabbed a metal tray, swinging it toward Eris's head. Eris ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and a man behind him tackled Byron to the floor. The two thrashed, limbs tangling in the narrow aisle as shoes skidded on the blood-smeared floor. A voice cracked over the intercom. "This is Captain Vaynar. Order must be restored immediately." Silence didn't follow. The call for calm was met with something else, fury. "No, he's the one who should be restrained," a passenger shouted. "Look what he did to that baby," another cried. More voices rose. Draven could feel the cabin shifting, not just physically but morally. For so long, authority had meant silence, obedience, fear, but not anymore. The tide was rising. Byron shoved the passenger off him and scrambled upright, blood dripping from a small cut on his cheek. His eyes were wild now, cornered and desperate. He grabbed the red canister from the emergency compartment, an industrial fire extinguisher, and brandished it like a weapon. "Everyone back," he barked, spittle flying from his lips. "I swear, I will knock you all out if I have to." The crowd recoiled slightly, instinct taking hold. The weapon in Byron's hands looked solid and cold. Dangerous. But it wasn't enough to stop the truth now clawing its way out. "Back down," Byron screamed again, swinging the extinguisher in a wide arc. That's when Malik stepped forward. His movements were hesitant, almost trembling, but there was something different in his eyes now. No longer blank obedience, but a flicker of humanity. He placed himself between Byron and Draven, his arms half raised, palms open. "Byron, don't," he said, his voice thin but steady. "This has gone far enough." Byron didn't flinch. His grip tightened. "Move, Malik." Malik stood firm. His lips quivered slightly, but he didn't move. "We hurt a baby. We broke his legs. We're not enforcers. We're crew. This isn't who we are." Byron's jaw twitched. "They'll turn on us if we give in." "They already have," Malik whispered. The extinguisher trembled in Byron's hands. His shoulders heaved with rage and confusion, sweat glistening along his brow. Around him, passengers watched, cameras raised, eyes wide, the world outside already watching through every lens. Draven shifted, his body still shielding Kale. He met Malik's eyes, searching. The same man who had crushed his son's legs now stood between him and another strike. Draven said nothing. He didn't have to. Malik took another step toward Byron. "Put it down." Byron looked around the cabin. Every set of eyes glared back at him, no longer afraid, no longer silent. He saw no escape in their faces, only judgment. In that moment, the illusion of control snapped, and Malik said, quieter this time, "No more." Byron stared at him for one long, hateful second, then dropped the extinguisher with a metallic thud. The clang rang through the cabin like the tolling of a bell, announcing the end of tyranny. Passengers exhaled in unison, as though emerging from underwater. Eris leaned against the seat, bleeding from a cut near his ear but still upright. Simon peeked from behind the curtain near the galley, his face pale and trembling, but watching. And Draven, standing in the center of it all, his son pressed against his heart, let the weight of the moment settle over him. The pain still roared. The injustice still burned. But the tide had shifted. The plane had not landed, but the battle inside it had begun to turn. His gaze met Malik's once more. The man who had caused so much pain now stood hollow and shaking, but no longer blind. And in that moment, the cabin felt changed. The tide was turning, and justice had begun to claw its way back into the fight. The roar of defiance erupted like thunder in the confined cabin. Passengers surged forward, no longer frozen by fear. Their bodies pressed through narrow aisles, pushing Byron back toward the galley in a wave of collective fury. The overhead lights flickered slightly as turbulence rippled beneath the aircraft, but nothing could match the storm inside. Byron's voice, once commanding, now cracked under pressure. "Back to your seats! Everyone back down!" he barked, his tone shrill and desperate. But the words had lost their weight. No one obeyed. Eris Danner was the first to grab him, his arms shaking but determined. Two other men followed, one with a service badge around his neck, another still clutching a phone mid-recording. They wrestled Byron's limbs down, pinning him against the galley door. He thrashed like a cornered animal, his teeth bared, eyes wild with disbelief that the power he wielded so easily minutes ago had vanished. "Let go of me!" Byron screamed, his voice bouncing off metal in panic. "You don't know what you're doing." "We know exactly what we're doing," Eris replied, his grip tightening. "We're stopping you." Across the cabin, Malik dropped to his knees. The sound of Byron's collapse had shaken something loose inside him. His hands trembled, palms slick with sweat as he stared at the blood still smeared on his uniform. The scent of antiseptic and engine fuel lingered in the air, but all Malik could focus on was Cale's small, broken legs, the sound of that scream still echoing in his head. "I didn't mean," Malik's voice cracked as he looked toward Draven. "I didn't mean to." Draven said nothing at first. He sat motionless, Cale cradled tightly in his arms, wrapped in trembling protection. His breathing was shallow, controlled. His face was streaked with sweat and quiet rage. Slowly, he stood. Every muscle protested. Every bruise throbbed. But the silence that followed his rise was louder than Byron's shouts had ever been. Simon Hale appeared beside him, visibly shaken but no longer afraid. "We're documenting everything," he said loudly, turning to the cabin. "There will be no cover-up. Not this time." A few passengers raised their phones higher, others whispered words of encouragement. One man, elderly, his face drawn and tired, nodded toward Draven and murmured, "You're not alone." Draven looked down at Cale's pale face, streaked with dried tears and blood. His son whimpered faintly, clinging to the collar of his father's shirt. Draven leaned in, pressing his lips gently to Cale's forehead. The heat of the child's skin seared into his memory. Then he turned his gaze on Byron. Byron, restrained but still defiant, spat words from behind clenched teeth. "You think any of this will matter? The airline owns everything. They'll make this disappear like it never happened." But the lie rang hollow now. The cabin had shifted. The witnesses weren't afraid anymore. They weren't passengers. They were evidence. "I used to believe silence was safer," Draven said quietly, his voice steady, words measured. "But now I know. Silence is the only thing that keeps people like you in power." Byron jerked against the grip of the three men, but Eris didn't flinch. One of them reached into the overhead bin and tore free a pair of charging cables, looping them around Byron's wrists like makeshift restraints. His arms twisted behind his back, he could only glare and sputter. His aura of control crumbled with every passing second. In the back of the plane, someone tried to contact the flight crew again. The cockpit remained silent. No intercom, no announcement. The delay spoke volumes. The pilots were watching, listening, perhaps waiting to see if the cabin resolved itself or erupted. Foreshadowing hung like smoke. Malik remained on the floor, eyes locked on Draven. "I was scared," he said, almost inaudible. "He told us we'd be fired if we didn't fall in line." Draven's eyes didn't soften, but neither did they burn. "You hurt my son," he said flatly, "but you also stopped him from doing worse." The words lingered in the air, both accusation and reluctant acknowledgement. Malik nodded slowly, shame etched into every line of his face. Simon cleared his throat. "This plane still has hours before landing," he said to the cabin, "but we're not letting this go. When we touch down, every phone, every statement, every recording will be shared." Someone clapped. Then another. The applause was hesitant but real. It grew, not loud, but powerful in its intent. Byron shrank at the sound, as if each beat pulled him further from control. Draven shifted Cale in his arms, stepping forward with slow, deliberate steps. He passed Byron without a word. He didn't need one. His silence was heavier than any threat Byron could muster. He looked to the rest of the cabin. Eyes met his with empathy, solidarity, and a burning need for justice. Then he leaned down, whispering into Kyle's ear, his breath trembling only slightly. "They thought they broke us, but this fight has only begun." The cabin had transformed from prison to battleground, and soon it would become a courtroom. When the wheels of Horizon Air Flight 719 struck the runway with a dull thud, a shiver of stillness passed through the cabin, not the usual collective sigh of landing relief, but something quieter, heavier. No one unclipped their seatbelt. No one reached for their bags. The plane had landed, but its passengers remained frozen in place as though unsure the nightmare had truly ended. Byron Kessler sat slumped in row 12, wrists bound tightly with cords and makeshift zip ties fashioned from belts and headphone wires. His face, once flushed with arrogant command, now simmered with restrained fury. The man who had paced the aisles like a king now looked like a prisoner awaiting judgment. Draven Holt sat 2 rows behind him, cradling Cale close against his chest. The baby whimpered softly. The bandages wrapped hastily around his broken legs stained faintly pink. Draven's jaw clenched as he stroked his son's hair, every gentle pass of his hand masking the storm that boiled inside him. He had not slept, nor wept. Not yet. There would be time for that later. Now he had to make sure the truth survived this landing. Simon Hale remained by his side, sweat sticking his collar to his neck. His hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The younger attendant hadn't spoken since announcing their emergency over the intercom, but his presence was steady. He hadn't run when things fell apart, and Draven silently acknowledged that with a firm nod. The cabin door hissed open, and a rush of colder air spilled in. Emergency responders boarded quickly, but not with the urgency the situation demanded. Their movements were hesitant, eyes darting between Byron, the passengers, and the man at the center of it all, Draven. One of the medics stepped forward, a lanky man with a silver patch in his hair, and looked uncertainly toward the cockpit before addressing Draven. "Sir, we need to examine the situation before—" "Start with the child," Draven interrupted, voice low but commanding. "Now." The medic flinched but nodded. "Of course." He and another man leaned in, carefully taking Cale into their arms. The baby whimpered, but didn't resist. His body had given all it could. As the medics moved down the aisle toward the rear, their shoulders seemed to shrink inward, as if weighed down by more than equipment. They glanced repeatedly toward the jet bridge as if expecting orders or interference. And they weren't wrong to be wary. A tall man in a navy suit, sharp tie knotted high, stood just beyond the threshold of the open door. Derek Sloan, operations manager for Horizon Air, stepped inside with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a look of forced calm on his face. He wore authority like armor, but his eyes betrayed it, a flicker of panic behind the professional smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the cabin as though hosting a safety seminar, "we ask that you remain seated. Our team will assist you 1 row at a time. There will be time to speak with—" "No," said Eris Danner, rising from his seat near the rear galley. He held his phone high, screen lit. "We're not going anywhere until someone hears what really happened here." Several passengers murmured in agreement. Some raised their phones too, not to record, but to show solidarity. It was the first coordinated act of resistance since the uprising in the sky, and it was working. Derek hesitated, his practiced tone faltering. "Sir, I assure you, we will be conducting an internal review." "You mean cover-up?" Eris shot back. "Don't bother. This whole plane saw it. We recorded it." Sloane's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His gaze flicked toward Byron, still restrained, his breathing now shallow but erratic. The silence in the cabin thickened again, not out of fear, but anticipation. Draven rose slowly, cradling Cale's now empty blanket against his chest. His movements were precise, every step deliberate. He didn't need to shout. His presence alone cut through the tension like steel through silk. He turned to face Sloane. "Where were your protocols when my son was screaming?" he asked, his voice firm but calm. "Where was your chain of command when your employee assaulted a child?" Sloane stammered, This was a rogue incident. Not representative." "No," Draven said, shaking his head. "Don't waste breath on damage control. We all know what this was." He gestured toward Byron without even looking at him. "And so does he." Behind Draven, Simon took a step forward, standing straighter now. "I called the cockpit. I sent messages through the internal system. I begged them to intervene. They saw the feed, they knew, and they hesitated." The weight of that word, hesitated, seemed to hang in the air longer than any shout could. Sloane tried to regain control. "Let's deboard now. There will be statements taken later through official—" "No," said Draven again. "Statements will be taken now, before anything disappears, before evidence vanishes." He turned back to the cabin, addressing the passengers, his voice steady. "If you have recordings, keep them safe. If you witness this, speak your truth, because this airline will try to rewrite what happened here. Don't let them." Eris nodded. "We're not letting this die. We all saw it. We all recorded it." The crowd murmured louder, voices joining with conviction. Phones were raised, not in defense, but as weapons of truth. Sloane took a step back, his mouth set in a hard line. He understood now. He wasn't just facing one man. He was facing a cabin full of them. Outside, flashing lights glared through the cabin windows. The medics returned to escort Kyle to the ambulance. Draven followed, his steps slow but unyielding. As he crossed the threshold of the aircraft, he looked once more at the people still inside, the ones who had stayed silent, and the ones who had found their voice. Simon stood at the door, watching him leave. Malik remained behind, head bowed, consumed by guilt. But the silence was gone. The world was already watching. The landing had ended the flight, but the war for truth had only just taken off. The footage hit the internet like a lightning strike, shaky, dim, and full of turbulence distortion, but what it showed was irrefutable. A grainy clip of Byron Kessler forcing Draven Holt into his seat, one hand on the father's chest, the other gesturing toward Malik Wren as the larger attendant approached with brutal calm. Another clip showed Malik pressing Cale's tiny legs against the metal armrest, the infant's scream caught just before the phone shook violently, the image blurring into chaos. Yet the most haunting image, the one that flooded timelines and news cycles, was of the blood-stained blanket, held aloft by a trembling passenger like a protest banner. Public outrage didn't build, it exploded. Within hours, hashtags trended globally. News anchors' voices cracked with disbelief as they narrated the unfolding horror, while legal analysts dissected every frame, confirming what viewers already knew in their hearts. This was not a misunderstanding. It was an assault. Horizon Air scrambled to respond, their first press release hastily written and cold. The incident aboard Flight 719 is under review. We are cooperating fully with authorities. The actions of one crew member do not reflect the values of our airline. They framed Byron as a lone actor, a rogue employee operating under stress, and cast Malik and Simon Hale as confused subordinates caught in the moment. The attempt to minimize fell flat. Viewers had seen the truth. From a sterile hospital room lined with quiet machines and white walls, Draven watched the storm gather. Cale lay beside him, legs wrapped in padded splints, small face pale from medication. A beep echoed from the heart monitor every few seconds. Draven hadn't left his son's side, but now justice pulled him to his feet. He called Malcolm Vey. Malcolm arrived that same night, briefcase in one hand, expression carved in granite. "They'll try to bury this," he said, voice low as he stood by the window watching reporters gather below. "We need to move fast. Preserve every video, every message, every witness statement, before they scrub it clean." Draven nodded, eyes fixed on Kyle. "I want more than justice. I want a reckoning. I want them to remember what happened when they touched my son." Malcolm's mouth pressed into a firm line. "Then we give them something they can't erase." The next morning, Draven's team assembled at his downtown apartment, transformed now into a legal war room. Phones buzzed, screens flickered, witnesses sent clips anonymously. Some passengers offered statements, others hesitated, afraid of airline retaliation. Draven made a video appeal from Cale's bedside, voice steady. "I am not asking for vengeance. I'm asking for every parent, every traveler, to know that this will never happen again. We are not staying silent." But the silence fought back. Threatening letters appeared in his mailbox unsigned, laced with veiled warnings. "You have a family. You should protect them." Anonymous numbers called late at night. Men whispered into the line, promising destruction, financial ruin, legal traps. One morning, Malcolm entered the apartment holding a black envelope, eyes grim. This one was taped to the front door. Draven read it. One line. "You've made a powerful enemy. Stand down." He folded the paper slowly, then dropped it into the shredder without a word. "They're bluffing," he said, "and you only bluff when you're scared." Still, the pressure mounted. Cale's injuries became a point of debate in online forums, strangers claiming the baby was fine, that the videos were staged. Media personalities questioned Draven's character, pulling old business disagreements into the spotlight. One anchor even suggested he had orchestrated the incident for publicity. The smear campaign had begun, but for every lie, the truth grew louder. Simon Hale called late one evening, voice shaking. "I need to talk. Not just about Byron. It's bigger." Draven stepped into the hallway, shutting the hospital room door. "Talk." "There were meetings," Simon said. "Not official, but implied. Certain passengers were called problem profiles, people who stirred trouble. The idea was to discourage them. Crew were told to keep them in line. Byron took it to an extreme, but he wasn't alone. Draven's jaw clenched. You have proof? Emails. I saved some. I didn't know what they were at first, but now I see it. Send them to Malcolm, Draven said, his voice cold steel. And Simon, thank you. I know that wasn't easy. As Simon hung up, Draven stood motionless, staring down the hospital hallway. The walls around him weren't closing in. They were falling away, revealing a deeper network of rot. This wasn't just about Byron or one flight. It was a system, a culture built to shield cruelty and silence truth. Malcolm entered moments later, holding a printed transcript of a passenger interview. Eris Danner just confirmed. The airline tried to offer him a settlement to stay quiet. No lawsuit, no press. Just disappear. Draven shook his head. They're trying to buy silence. They're trying to erase a crime, Malcolm corrected, but they're failing, because now everyone's watching. Below the apartment, cameras flashed as reporters surrounded the entrance. Across the city, a mural had been painted overnight. Cale's outline wrapped in a white blanket, a red stripe bleeding across it, and a simple caption underneath, Flight 719. Foreshadowing thickened with every breath. What had started with a single flight was no longer just about one man or one child. It was about every person who had ever been silenced mid-air, every incident brushed under corporate rugs, every uniform used to intimidate instead of protect. The system had declared war on a father's love, and now the father was returning fire with truth, law, and the eyes of a nation at his back. What began as one flight had become a mirror reflecting an industry's darkest face. The gavel struck sharply. The courtroom stilled. Byron Kessler sat stone-faced at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his eyes vacant as the first witness stepped forward. The judge motioned for the proceedings to begin, and just like that, the trial of Horizon Air versus Draven Holt was underway. Cameras weren't allowed, but the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes seemed to press down on every person in the room. The buzz from outside protests had faded behind thick courtroom walls, but the energy lingered, pulsing beneath the polished floors and dark wood paneling. Horizon Air's lead attorney, a tall man with a cold precision to his tone, rose. Your Honor, he began smoothly, we intend to prove that Mr. Holt, though grieving, has misunderstood a situation that spiraled beyond anyone's control, that the crew followed protocol, that his son's injuries, tragic as they may be, were not the result of malice, but confusion. Draven sat in silence, Cale's small casted legs cradled gently in his lap. His eyes never left the attorney's face. Not once. He didn't blink. The first passenger called was an older man named Elias Trent. He gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand like it was the only solid thing left in his world. I saw it happen, he said, voice shaking. I saw that man, Byron, push Draven down. I saw the other attendant grab the baby. I heard the scream. He paused, eyes darting to the jury, then back to Draven. You don't forget a sound like that. It breaks something inside you. The defense objected. Speculative. Emotional manipulation. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Let the man speak. Witness after witness followed, passengers, ordinary men with families of their own, their faces pale under the courtroom lights, each recounting the nightmare that had unfolded in the narrow rows of Flight 719. They spoke of Byron's cruelty, of the silence that had choked them, of the helplessness that haunted their dreams. The prosecutor, Malcolm Vey, paced slowly, deliberately, letting silence sit between questions to make the testimony settle deeper into the jury's bones. Then they called Malik Wren. A hush fell. Malik walked with a limp, not physical, but emotional. His hands shook as he raised them to take the oath. The courtroom watched as he struggled to hold himself upright. When asked why he'd done what he did, his voice broke. I didn't know how to stop it, he whispered. Byron, he had this grip over everyone, over me. When he said to do it, I looked into that baby's face and his throat caught. I did it anyway. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Draven's gaze bore into Malik, unreadable, but unwavering. Malik didn't look away. I was scared, Malik continued, but that doesn't matter. I hurt a child. I broke something innocent, and I'll carry that the rest of my life. There was no objection, no interruption. Even Horizon Air's lawyers stayed still. The moment spoke louder than any cross-examination ever could. Then came Simon Hale. The young flight attendant's face was pale but resolute. He brought with him a folder, its edges worn. Inside were printed emails dated months before the incident. He read aloud, hands trembling slightly. "We encourage firmness with difficult passengers. Disruptive clients should be dealt with swiftly to avoid delays. Crew who assert authority will be rewarded accordingly." The room grew colder. "Who wrote those emails?" asked Malcolm. "Supervisors at Horizon Air," Simon said. "They called it discipline, but we all knew what it really meant. And Byron? He followed it to the letter." The judge leaned forward, brows furrowed. Even jurors who had remained stone-faced up to this point shifted in their seats. A crack had formed in the airline's polished armor. The final witness to speak was Draven. He didn't rise immediately. He sat with Cale nestled against his shoulder, the child's leg heavy in a white cast. When he finally stood, the room held its breath. He walked slowly to the front, every step deliberate. When he turned to the jury, his voice was calm, steady, deeper than the room. "I'm not here for money," he said. "I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here because something happened on that plane that should never happen again. My son," he paused, eyes flickering to Cale, "wasn't a threat. He was a baby, crying, and for that, they broke his legs. No one moved. I was held down, silenced, made to watch while men in uniform committed violence, in the name of order. But what they didn't expect was that the people they silenced would speak." His gaze traveled the room, settling on each juror. "They didn't just break my son's bones. They exposed their own corruption." He sat. No further words were needed. Outside the courtroom, a storm of voices began to rise, chanting, demanding reform, justice, truth. And inside, the truth could no longer be silenced. The trial was no longer about one man. It was about whether cruelty could ever hide behind a uniform again. The courtroom fell still as the foreman of the jury stood. Every breath seemed held in suspension. Every sound outside the walls of that chamber felt distant and unreal. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Draven Holt," the foreman declared, his voice steady but solemn. "We recommend maximum damages be awarded. Further, we urge the enforcement of mandatory corporate reforms and independent oversight of Horizon Air's internal conduct." The silence shattered. Gasps broke across the courtroom like falling glass. Draven exhaled slowly, as though releasing the weight of the entire flight from his chest. He sat still for a moment, holding Cale, whose legs were encased in gentle casts beneath the soft hospital blanket. The child stirred faintly, unaware that justice had just thundered through the room like a storm finally come. Byron Kessler, seated with arms folded tightly at the defense table, didn't blink. His once ever-present smirk was gone, replaced by a clenched jaw and trembling hands. A marshal stepped forward to take him into custody. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Byron twisted once, eyes meeting Draven's for only a second before dropping to the floor. The smugness, the dominance, the hatred, it had all evaporated beneath the weight of accountability. "Get up," the marshal ordered, his tone flat. Byron stood, though reluctantly, his eyes no longer defiant, but hollow. The courtroom watched in total silence as he was led away. For a moment, the entire room remained frozen, trapped between disbelief and relief. Malik Wren, seated just behind the witness bench, wiped at his face with trembling fingers. His testimony had been raw, full of shame and regret. Though he had once held Cale's tiny legs in his powerful hands, now those same hands gripped the edge of the bench, desperate for redemption. The judge addressed him firmly, but not without compassion. "Mr. Wren, while your actions were grave, your cooperation, honesty, and willingness to aid the investigation have been taken into account. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years of community service, specifically in service of child advocacy and trauma prevention programs. I hope you understand what that means." Malik's voice broke as he answered, "I do, Your Honor. I truly do." His face, once stone-like and distant, now carried the deep etchings of regret. As he was escorted out under far gentler circumstances, his shoulders sagged, not with shame alone, but with the burden of a second chance. Simon Hale remained seated quietly, surrounded by a few legal observers. His eyes glistened, not with pride, but with release. The silence he had once carried like armor had broken open on the witness stand, his voice trembling as he recounted what he had seen, what he had feared, and what he had failed to stop. The judge didn't sentence him. There was no need. Simon's scars weren't visible, but they were heavy. Reporters outside were already typing. The trial, the verdict, the people involved, it would headline across every news platform before the sun fully set. But for Draven, none of that mattered at this moment. He turned slowly to Malcolm Vey, his longtime legal strategist. Malcolm gave him a small, firm nod. Victory confirmed, justice secured. But it wasn't celebration in Draven's chest. It was something deeper, more solemn. His gaze dropped to Cale. His son had been the reason for every breath, every argument, every sleepless night leading up to this moment. In the days that followed, the world reacted. Videos from Flight 719 had been played in courtroom exhibits, and now they were broadcast on every screen. The images were grainy, yet haunting. Byron pinning Draven down, Malik's hands on Cale, the blood-stained blanket raised by a passenger as a symbol of rebellion. The court ruling ignited a national conversation about abuse of authority, about accountability in the skies, and the dignity of every passenger, regardless of their status, race, or background. Horizon Air issued a flurry of press statements. Byron had been a rogue actor, they claimed. Malik was manipulated. Simon was commended for his bravery. But the public didn't buy the corporate spin. The emails, the crew culture, the recordings, they all told a story too loud to bury. Draven stood beneath a bright sun weeks later, cameras flashing before him, a podium in front, and Cale at his side in a stroller. A bold banner waved behind him. The Holt Foundation. Justice in motion. The foundation wasn't about revenge, it was about prevention. It was about ensuring that no passenger, no father, no child would suffer in silence again. Flanked by volunteers, lawyers, and supporters, Draven addressed the nation, voice calm, steady, and carved from truth. This was never about power, he said, the wind catching his words and carrying them across the silent crowd. This was about dignity, and dignity must never be broken. Passengers from Flight 719 stood in the audience, some still holding the same phones they had used to record that night, others clasping each other's hands in quiet solidarity. Behind them, the world watched, not just a victory, but a reckoning. What began as a father's nightmare ended as a nation's awakening. Seconds later, the father struck back, and the whole cabin saw who really held the power. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, abuse of authority, and the devastating impact of unchecked cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke thought about accountability in public-facing professions, and inspire action toward justice, protection, and dignity for all.